So they go and they arrest him. They arrest a guy who came to New York to turn himself in.
Sean Diddy Combs is dominating headlines right now as the Southern District of New York files criminal charges against him in a sex trafficking and racketeering probe. And the evidence they've laid out so far is pretty substantial. But as the rapper now sits behind bars, we're going to discuss what are his defenses moving forward. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. The rap icon, known by so many names, Diddy, Puff Daddy, Love, Sean Combs, he now has a new identifier. He is an indicted conspirator. Yes, Sean Diddy Combs is behind bars in the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, also known as the MDC. He's not the first high-profile defendant to end up there. You might recall that the MDC has also housed Bernie Madoff, R. Kelly, and of course, Jeffrey Epstein. Now, Combs entered a not guilty plea in federal court on Tuesday to charges of racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, and transportation to engage in prostitution. And we're going to get into some of the defenses that he may have and how strong is the prosecution's case, because I'll tell you, after yesterday, I was able to sit down with the indictment last night. I took a little bit more time to think about it and what is actually being alleged and what the government has to prove. So we're going to talk about this in a minute, but let's not forget, all of this comes, 6 months after simultaneous raids on Combs' properties, one in Los Angeles, the other one in Miami. Homeland Security investigators, they had served search warrants on the homes, bringing boxes and boxes of evidence out. And it wasn't just the indictment that we were talking about yesterday. No, both the prosecution and the defense, they sent letters to U.S. District Court Judge Robin Tarnofsky laying out why Combs should or should not get bail, pretrial release. And then, during Combs' first appearance, he entered his not guilty plea, and the attorneys made oral arguments on this bail issue. In fact, we learned new details from a Law&Crime reporter inside the courtroom during that hearing that we want to share with you. We didn't get a chance to talk about it yesterday. By the way, no cameras are allowed, so we don't have that opportunity. There's a courtroom sketch. That's probably one of the only things we'll get of a visual of what's happening in that courtroom. But we do have the inside scoop about what went down and more allegations that were made against Sean Combs. So the main point that the prosecution wanted to hammer home to the judge is that Sean Combs seems to be engaging in witness tampering on a pretty grand scale. I'll give you an example. The assistant U.S. attorney talked about the most recent woman to file a lawsuit against Combs, Dawn Richard, the former member of the girl group Danity Kane, this musical group. She filed a lawsuit just a few weeks ago, and she claimed that Combs sexually and verbally abused her for a decade. She also claimed that Combs owes her more than $3 million in unpaid salary and royalties, as well as unpaid wages for touring. Danity Kane was this female singing group that was formed on Combs' MTV show Making the Band 3. Now, at one point when the group disbanded, Richard had joined a trio with Combs and another singer, Kalina Harper, which was called Diddy Dirty Money. And in that recent lawsuit, Richard mentioned Harper more than 30 times. She claimed that she and Harper both witnessed Combs abusing his then-girlfriend, Cassandra Ventura, who would go on to file a multi-million-dollar lawsuit of her own and seems to play a role in this indictment. Well, 2 days after that lawsuit was filed, Harper posted a response on Instagram saying, quote, "I acknowledge the recent lawsuit filed by Dawn Richard in which my name has been mentioned 33 times. While I fully respect Dawn's rights to recount her experiences, I want to emphasize that her account reflects her personal perspective and should not be interpreted as a universal truth applicable to everyone involved. It's important to understand that while I was present in some of the things professional settings mentioned, many of the allegations and incidents described in this suit are not representative of my experiences, and some do not align with my own truth." Well, according to the prosecution in Combs' criminal case, the rapper allegedly called Harper 54 times in one day. And that day happened to be the day before Harper put out her statement denouncing Richard's claims. Now, prosecutors say they were worried that if Combs were released on bail, more possible witness tampering might happen. Combs, you see, had come to New York earlier this month, staying at the Park Hyatt Hotel for nearly 2 weeks before his arrest. And despite claiming to be on his best behavior while he was here, police say they found a bag of pink powder in Combs' hotel room that tested positive for ecstasy, which is, not great for him. By the way, I have to say thank you for coming to us for our coverage of the Sean Combs case. We really, really appreciate your trust in us. And honestly, we're able to continue to do this because of the support that not only we get from you guys, but also that we get from our sponsors. And if I can, I just want to highlight one in particular right now, Morgan & Morgan. If you're injured, this firm with over 1,000 attorneys may be who you want in your corner because they're America's largest injury law firm. And for a reason, they win a lot. Clients get a dedicated army that includes a legal team, case investigators, paralegals, customer case specialists. There's no upfront fee. You only pay them if you win. The whole process can be done straight from your smartphone. So if you're injured, you can easily start a claim at forthepeople.com/LC Sidebar. Now, defense counsel insisted in court that Combs isn't a bully. They hinted that there may be more to the story when it comes to some of the evidence against their client. But in that indictment, there is also a reference to that 2016 leaked surveillance footage of Combs allegedly beating his ex, Cassandra Ventura, in a Los Angeles hotel. And the prosecution says that Ventura was trying to leave the hotel after a freak-off session. These are sex parties that Combs allegedly held at hotels in his home where women would be brought in, as well as sex workers, that they would be forced to take drugs and have sex with each other, sometimes for days on end. And the surveillance was some of the first visual proof that the public saw of what Ventura and others had claimed happened to them. The prosecution says it's also evidence of bribery because Combs allegedly tried to pay a security guard stacks of cash to keep quiet. The guard says he didn't take it, but the video disappeared from the hotel security system. So this is one of the factors that the prosecution is saying the judge should consider when talking about should Combs be allowed pretrial release. Well, Combs' defense team, they tried to put a different spin on what happened. They argue that victim one, who's identified in the indictment, believed to be Ventura, can't confirm it for sure, that she was looking through Combs' phone and discovered that he had more than one girlfriend. And they allege she hit him in the head with the phone and took off with his clothes, which is why she was running down the hotel hallway in that 2016 video and he was running down the hallway in just that towel. The defense claims Combs and Ventura were in love and said that Ventura cheated on Combs for years with a personal trainer. Apparently, Ventura married her husband, Alex Fine, in 2019, who is notably a personal trainer. Well, on Tuesday, Judge Tarnofsky heard all of this and denied bail for Combs, saying there has been significant violence and weapons around, also coercion of witnesses. Even gentle coercion can be effective. The type of behavior we're talking about happens behind closed doors. I thank your family members for coming, but I cannot release him. Well, Combs' lawyer, Mark Agnifilo, spoke briefly with the press about this turn of events in the case.
I think that we made the points that we've been wanting to make. I think it came out. Mr. Combs is a fighter. He's going to fight this to the end. He's innocent. He came to New York to establish his innocence. He's not afraid. He's not afraid of the charges. There's nothing that the government said in their presentation today that changes anyone's mind about anything. He's been looking forward to this day. He's been looking forward to clearing his name, and he's going to clear his name. And we're going to stand by his side as he does. We believe in him wholeheartedly. He didn't do these things. This was a 10-year relationship. There's no coercion. There's no crime. There's basically just, someone who brought a civil case and now is finding themselves as a witness in a criminal case. And we're going to fight this case with everything we have, as is he. And eventually he's going to be shown to be innocent. And so tomorrow we fight again, and we'll fight every day until we don't have to fight anymore.
And the defense told the judge that they had been working with law enforcement to arrange a time for Combs to turn himself in on Tuesday. Instead, police, they say, took him into custody at the Park Hyatt Hotel in Manhattan on Monday night. Combs' attorney says that was intentional on the part of the prosecution.
I just want to make one point very clear. We have no power. All we can do is show good faith. He got on a plane and he came here. And if he stayed here for one day before the case started or for 1 year before the case started, he was going to stay as long as he needed to stay. It ends up being only 12 days. That's fine. That's what the government wanted to do. The government didn't want him to turn himself in. He came here to turn himself in. Why doesn't the government want him to turn himself in? Because then they can't ask for detention. So they go and they arrest him. They arrest a guy who came to New York to turn himself in. But we're going to make all these points again tomorrow, and we'll make him as much as we can until we get him out.
And now I should tell you that at the time of this recording of this episode, That bond appeal hearing has not happened yet. We're going to keep you updated with new details as they come in. But one other detail I should tell you about before we get into the defenses is that Combs' sons, Christian and Justin, they were in that courtroom as well, along with a few other supporters. And the group made only one comment outside the courthouse after the hearing.
No, we support Diddy. What's up? We the supporters.
And in terms of a defense, we also got a small taste of how the defense plans to tell Combs' side of the story. Because when it comes to the freak-offs, Combs' attorney says it's not sex trafficking if everyone wants to be there. And we've talked with several high-profile attorneys here on Sidebar already about how that's going to be a sticking point in the prosecution. Can they prove coercion? Can they prove that people were forced to do those things? And I should tell you, Combs faces a minimum of 15 years in prison if he's convicted on all charges, and potentially life in prison. So now with all that in mind, let's talk about possible defenses for Sean Combs. And for that, I want to bring in criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor, Safa Robinson-Ferrer. Thank you so much for coming on, Safa. Good to see you once again. So let's start with that one. This idea that everything's consensual. If everything was consensual, then does this case fall apart? Is that a defense?
You know, that's not necessarily true that the case would fall apart. There are a number of charges that Mr. Combs is facing in this indictment. Not only are they alleging sexual acts, but they're alleging trafficking along state lines or via interstate commerce. They're also alleging narcotic activity or drug activity with respect to Mr. Combs as well. So it's not necessarily that the case would fall apart if everyone agrees that it's consensual. I think that's certainly a positive point for the defense, and that's what we're going to want to get to, is that everybody was a willing participant here. And so that would essentially negate certain elements of the crime, including the kidnapping or certain predicate offenses that there may have to be a finding of in order to sustain that RICO conviction.
Let's take one thing at a time. I'm going to get to racketeering and RICO because that's obviously takes up the majority of this indictment. But first, when you talk about sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, if the defense can prove that force, fraud, or coercion was not used and that this victim one, and by the way, it seems like this is only in regard to victim one, count two, right? Did you get the same reading? That's one.
That's what it appeared to be. Yeah, that's what it appeared to be.
So if you can say that this one person was not induced by any kind of illegal means to engage in activity, and you could say she wasn't promised anything of value or she wasn't paid, then it's no longer a commercial sex act. Am I right?
That's going to depend as things roll out, because I think one of the things the prosecution may be trying to show is that these sex workers that were hired by Mr. Combs and his team were a part of that sex act. So although victim one may ultimately be found to be a willing participant, what is the level of culpability for hiring these sex workers and transporting them via interstate lines? So that's one of the things that we're going to have to look at as well.
And that's more count three, right? Transportation for prostitution, right? That seems to be, I think it's with regarding to multiple victims, and we don't know who these people are, but that would be, if it's prostitution, it's prostitution. That's bad for Diddy, for Combs.
Absolutely. Okay. If it's prostitution, it's prostitution. And the traveling component certainly isn't going to be a good factor for him.
Before we get into racketeering, the fact that no one has been publicly identified in that indictment, there's a reference to victim one, there's a general statement to victims. Does that show a weakness in the prosecution's case or no?
I don't think it does, Jesse. What it is they're protecting their victim. They're protecting their witnesses. There have been allegations of witness tampering in this case, and I think that was something that was mentioned at the arraignment by the judge. And there's a significant concern for that. We don't want any retaliation towards victim one, whoever that person may be, or other witnesses that may be participating in this prosecution. So that would be the reason that the prosecution is withholding that information for now.
So one of the things, and again, we're going to get into racketeering in a second, but one of the things, if I'm trying to determine if there's a weakness in the prosecution's case, is what's not in there. There were allegations made, for example, in Rodney Jones' civil lawsuit against Combs, and he sued him for sex trafficking and sexual assault and racketeering, that he was tasked with soliciting minors for Sean Combs. We know if you put minors in an indictment, that's a stepping point. That's a different kind of case. That's going to be really hard for a defendant to defend against. Minors can't consent. Look what happened to R. Kelly in his federal indictment. Also, what's not in this indictment, is he is not charged specifically with kidnapping or forced labor or arson, even though that might be a state crime. He's not charged in, or let me put it this way, he's not even charged with the federal crime of possession of a firearm with an obliterated serial number. That's an allegation in this overall racketeering case, but he's not charged specifically with those crimes. So if the name of the game is to try to convict Sean Combs and not necessarily throw everything at him, but this is the main indictment, they've been working on it for months, you would think they would include everything they possibly can to secure a conviction. What's not in the indictment, does that tell you anything about potential weaknesses in the prosecution's case?
Well, I think it goes to show that, first and foremost, this indictment is pretty bare bones. And so, although there may be limited allegations in the indictment, we can certainly find, as things progress through the discovery process, through hearings and things of that nature, the full context of what the government is alleging. There's no indication here that these are sex crimes alleged against children. To your point that the prior civil suit, there was an indication that this individual was seeking out underage minors for Mr. Combs. That's not alleged here. So I think what the government is trying to do essentially is fine tune and fine point what Mr. Combs is allegedly or what he's alleged to have done, and sticking to the point of what they can prove. If they can't prove it, they're not going to allege it, and they're not going to waste their time doing that.
How do you defend a racketeering conspiracy charge like the one that Combs is facing?
Racketeering charges are certainly difficult. They are essentially a catch-all sort of charge for the prosecution to use as a tool to gain a conviction based on underlying predicate crimes. And so there are a number of things that the government has to prove with respect to RICO, including the enterprise factor, predicate crimes, essentially, and showing a pattern of behavior with those crimes. And so it can be essentially pretty easy for the government to prove those if the evidence is there. Although they are making that allegation, though, it doesn't mean that they are going to that they're going to sustain a conviction on the back end. They can be difficult to prove. And I think what the defense is going to have to do here is take everything apart and go charge by charge and basically, exploit the weaknesses of the prosecution with respect to these cases, to the point earlier of whether any individual was consenting, whether or not there's an underlying conviction or a pattern of behavior that can be shown. So those are all of the things that the defense is going to want to attack in terms of defending this RICO charge.
So yeah, a racketeering charge like this is there's a criminal enterprise. There's an agreement to further the goals of this criminal enterprise. The goals are to satisfy Combs' sexual desires, to protect his reputation, to make money, and they do this through a number of means. They use fraud, they use coercion, they use threats, they use intimidation. They've engaged in, this is the allegations, kidnapping, forced labor, arson. Those predicate crimes, right? So those are things that he's not charged with individually, but they're saying this is evidence to show you there's a criminal organization right here. Do prosecutors have to prove all of those predicate crimes beyond a reasonable doubt? Is that something, are they going to have to, and it's strange because a lot of those are state crimes, right? They're like, if you're talking arson, that's a state crime. So how much do they have to prove to the jury that, you know what, we have evidence that he blew up Kid Cudi's car. We have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. I mean, how much do prosecutors have to prove predicate crimes, those underlying crimes, in order to get a conviction of racketeering?
In order to get that conviction, the prosecution doesn't have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, but they have to show that based on a preponderance of the evidence that these crimes did take place and within a specified time period. There are a number of crimes that can be used as predicate crimes. So the prosecution actually just has to tie all of that in, showing that there's a pattern of behavior, showing that these patterns of behavior were to further that enterprise's goal in criminal activity.
And we see something very similar in the Young Thug racketeering trial, because when they're trying to say there was a conspiracy, there was an agreement among everybody to further the interest of this gang, and there's all these overt acts. A lot of them aren't even crimes. It could be like a phone call, it could be a text message. So it doesn't have to be crimes, but in this indictment, they have listed so much illegal activity that they're saying is proof that there was a criminal organization that he was the head of. But I guess the other ways to say is there wasn't an organization. There wasn't, and by the way, you don't need to have like a legal enterprise LLC, right? You don't need an actual organization. It just has to be what? Combs agreeing with his associates to do this? I mean, how do you say there's an enterprise? How do you say there's this, I guess, this agreement together to break the law and that there's a common enterprise, a common goal, a common scheme? How do you prove that? And how do you, as a defense attorney, say there's nothing there?
Well, in terms of proving that, the racketeering conspiracy casts a wide net over certain activity. Not only that, but phone calls and things of that nature that can further certain illegal activity will be used as evidence against the defendant in that particular case. And so what we have here include other workers that worked for Mr. Combs, such as assistants, home people that worked in his home, other individuals that worked with him to essentially further that goal of having Mr. Combs, with these freak offs and transporting individuals and things of that nature. Although he may have not been the one to essentially direct it, the argument is that these individuals that work with Mr. Combs have all worked together or in concert to allow those things to occur. And so that's what the government is going to want to show and is essentially going to show throughout this case. Now, from the defense perspective, we're going to try to move Mr. Combs out of that equation, although he may own Bad Boy Entertainment or what other labels they're going to umbrella this under, that he was an individual that was off to himself, and these other individuals, we're going to have to break the chain of them working by his direction or at his direction. It's going to be pretty difficult to do. The evidence, if it's there, it'd be hard to say, Mr. Combs didn't direct or didn't benefit from this sort of activity.
Let me ask you this, talking about the evidence. In the government's letter where they're asking for the bail to be denied, they say that they've interviewed 50 witnesses and victims. I imagine when this goes to trial, if this goes to trial, it's going to be a very dense, long prosecution, long case. Does the defense just cross-examine every one of these people and say they're a liar? And is that effective? I mean, if you have associates who are saying, I witnessed this, yeah, he threatened me, I did this for him. You have alleged victims, and we don't know how many there are, saying this happened to me, this happened to me, this happened to me. Do you have to say, what is the common theme from the defense? Do they have to say all of these people have a vendetta against Sean Combs? All of these people have an incentive to find him guilty because a lot of them, or maybe, have filed civil lawsuits against them? I mean, you're asking this jury to believe that so many people are not telling the truth. What does a defense attorney have to do there?
I think what the defense has to do here, and what sticks out in my mind, is that there was something that caused all of this to come out all of a sudden, whether that was Ms. Ventura's lawsuit at the end of last year or some other act. There started to become a domino effect once these allegations came about. So I think what the defense is going to want to do is get to the point of how did all of these allegations begin to come about? Was it through Ms. Ventura's lawsuit, or was it by some other means? And show the domino effect and how her lawsuit, or whatever the original means was, has affected and gotten other individuals to essentially follow suit and say, hey, well, there was a lawsuit here, there was a settlement of a high amount of money, I think I can make some sort of gain from this as well, because I allegedly participated to some effect. So I think what the defense is going to want to do is start to figure out how this initially occurred and attack every domino following how this ultimately laid out forward. And I don't think it's going to be helpful for the defense to get up and say, everybody's lying. But what they have to do is essentially show that individuals were cooperative, that there wasn't any criminal activity. While individuals can say that the behavior is, certainly questionable, it's not illegal to be sexually active, in this country. And there are other things that, as individuals, they may participate in, but it doesn't essentially make them illegal. So I think the defense is going to exploit those pieces through each and every witness. Not only that, but, and I'm sure this has probably occurred already or is in the process of occurring, is that the defense is going to want to do their own investigation to figure out who and what they need to negate the allegations here.
And final question before I let you go. The digital evidence, the physical evidence. So we already know there's this 2016 video. They said they've recovered so much digital evidence, not only from the raids on his properties, but from alleged victims, from associates, from witnesses they've spoken to. They found, 1,000 bottles of baby oil, I mean, as evidence of freak-offs. How does the defense attorney try to make sure, A, none of that comes into a trial, or B, if it does, to explain it away?
What the defense is going to want to do is they're going to want to challenge that search warrant that was granted, that was executed on those properties. So that's going to be the first thing. And they're going to do that through motion practices. And essentially, that will probably make it to the hearing stage should the defense do that. But that's how they're going to have to attack that. Ultimately, if the search warrant wasn't obtained under probable cause, or there wasn't enough evidence to get that search warrant, then there's an argument to have everything that was recovered to be suppressed. And so ultimately that's the angle that the defense is going to want to take on this, is that search warrant was obtained illegally. As a result of that illegality, the fruit, as we call it, of the poisonous tree should ultimately be suppressed and kept out at trial.
Totally different case, but Robert Kraft, remember that was a problem in terms of how they obtained that evidence there, and that case was torpedoed. Safa Robinson-Ferrer, such a pleasure having you on. Thank you so much. I really wanted to talk to you about potential defenses because I thought about it over the night as I was thinking about this indictment. Yesterday was more about just trying to break it down as quickly as possible, understand what was happening, and then I was like, wait a minute, how much can the prosecution prove here? And it's still the early stages. We don't know all the evidence and everything they have, but we shall see. Thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jesse. It was good seeing you.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us, and as always, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.